linear speed development, okay, in our movement training, so drill called lean, fall, run. We're working on learning how to produce power and cover ground over 3 strides. Resisted movement with the sled bound, with a single leg box hop is our first progression of plyos. It's a crossover sled example. Upper body power, okay, chest pass. Some movement drills, we're working on first progression of crossover movement and lateral shuffle movement. And again, we talked about progressions just a little bit. Each of those, this might be day 1 of our spring. So very basic progressions, and we increase complexity as they become proficient. So example of the workout sheet itself, again, you probably can't really see anything, but 3-day program, just to give you the idea, day 1, 2, 3, and then each category. Okay, this is A series, is our first block. Within that, snatch is our explosive lift, band pull squat is a mobility, half kneeling, anti-extension overhead press is core, we'll see that one in a moment, and then hip flexor stretch is again is stretcher mobility. So that's in our A series. If you look across, so A series on day 1, A series on day 2, the categories stay the same. Explosive lift, now we change, we're doing a clean. Band pull squat, still the mobility. Rollout, okay, eccentric rollout is that same anti-extension core, and then again hip flexor stretch. So the categories remain the same, okay? The exercises change from throughout each day, okay? And some of that depends on intensities and things like that, but basically, you can start to see that, that framework in place where we utilize sort of the same template. Depending on the day, we just change the exercise based on the need. And I'll show an example of the lift to get an idea what that looks like. A close grip snatch, hang snatch on a tempo. Band pull squat is a hip mobility squat pattern exercise, and this is that anti-extension overhead press. That bar is trying to pull them back into extension as they raise their hands, so they're trying to stay forward on it. Rear foot elevated split squat on a tempo. Second rep's much better. X pull down, upper body pull. And band, anti-rotation band press. So that band is trying to twist him as he presses out. He's resisting that rotation. Lower pull, called a slide board reverse lunge. It's actually very hip dominant. It doesn't look that way, but pulling through. Close grip tempo bench, upper body push. Tall kneeling lift. So now we're into our core diagonal pattern exercise for the day. And finally, loaded carry, kettlebell rack carry is one of the exercises. So post lift, okay, now our third category is into our ESD, our energy system development. The key question here is we need to ask ourselves, what system are we working on? Okay, we need to understand exactly what we're trying to improve. Are we working on the alactic, the lactic, or the aerobic system? Okay, that's the first problem we need to sort of define. By kind of my definition, what we're talking about, the alactic system, explosive short burst type work. Okay, power, explosive, 5 to 10 seconds in duration, needs a lot of rest in between to be able to produce power in it. The lactic system, okay, 30 seconds to a minute roughly of relatively high power output in hockey. This is where a lot of your energy system work is going to come from during a shift. Okay, hockey is a very lactic-based sport. And then the aerobic system. Okay, in hockey, why it's important? It allows your other two systems to recover and be able to repeat again. You don't have a well-developed aerobic system. Okay, even though you're not utilizing aerobic metabolism or energy in the sport, if the aerobic system is not well developed, you can't recover in between bouts of high intensity effort. You're only going to have 2 or 3 short bursts of 5 seconds of work and then you're cooked. Okay, and the hockey game is always 6 60 minutes or 65 with overtime, so you need to be able to sustain that effort. All three need development, just different amounts at different times, okay, in our methodology. We kind of break it up by season. As a basic example, in the preseason, okay, we're primarily concerned with lactic capacity. Okay, in the preseason, our priority is getting our athletes in practice shape. Okay, we want to be in great practice shape so that after about a month of preseason, I can hand these guys over to the head coach, and he can do whatever he needs to do on the ice. He can beat them up as much as he wants. He can spend as much time out there. They need to be ready to go day one for practice. If they can't keep up with his demands on the ice in practice, then I'm in trouble. He'll get them to game shape over the next couple of weeks, but primarily we need to get into that practice shape. In season, we're not doing a whole bunch of ESD work in season. When we do, it's mostly aerobic capacity work for a couple of reasons. One, that's sort of the bucket that doesn't get filled on the ice. You get a lot of lactic and alactic work on the ice in practice every day. There's not a whole lot of aerobic development, so we try to fill that bucket as needed to make sure that the aerobic system is functioning well. But also, we utilize the aerobic system for recovery-based purposes. So we'll do a little bit, generally on the bike. We have Airdyne bikes, and we'll spend 10 to 15 minutes as sort of a flush ride and get a little bit of both out of that. Early in the off-season, sort of the same idea. We're not going to do much ESD work. That's not the primary emphasis at that time of the year. If we do, it's a little bit of aerobic capacity to kind of maintain a certain level of fitness, make sure we can have the work capacity we need to accomplish what we need, strength and power-wise, but that's not the focus of training. When we get into the middle of the off-season, now we're starting to focus more on lactic power development, okay, and improving that quality. And then we come back around to the late off-season, leading back into the preseason. We go back more into a lactic capacity sort of genre. How do we develop these? Okay, as I said, the lactic system, we primarily in the off-season at least are going to address that post-lift. So when we do our ESD work, our conditioning work after a lift, we're mostly focused on the lactic system. We're going to break it up based on those that theme of movement for the day. So it's a linear-based day. We're going to be doing tempos and shuttle runs. Okay, in the off-season with hockey, we're going to run. We're going to stay off the bike primarily. In season, we would be on the bike and not run. Just as an aside, for me, with court-based sports, like when I was in volleyball and basketball, it was the opposite. Okay, when we did extra work in season, we definitely worked, or extra work in season we were going to run, but in the off season I was going to try to get them off their feet, at least for a significant period of time. Lateral days, we're going to utilize slide boards a lot. We'll also do things like multi-directional movement-based circuits. So agility circuits, things like that, where we're incorporating different movement skills and techniques, and we'll base all of those off of the time frames of the system we're trying to work on. So if we want alactic power development, if we want alactic capacity, for instance, we'll utilize short bursts of these movements, 5 seconds of work, and we'll make sure that we're not getting significant recovery so that we're pushing their capacity. If we want power, the alactic power system, same 5 seconds of work, but more rest, so we're allowing recovery. We can keep the output high, the power output high. We'll use Airdyne bikes, barbell circuits, kettlebell circuits, things like that, different tools. But generally, tempos and shuttles and slide boards are the main tools we're going to use. If you remember a couple slides ago, I starred the alactic and the aerobic system. The reason for that, primarily the way we're going to develop these two systems is within the training of the rest of our program. So we're not going to spend a lot of time doing aerobic work, sitting on the bike for 40 minutes, or doing road work, or things like that. We're not going to dedicate time post-lift for alactic work because we're not going to be able to develop power once we're fatigued. So the way we develop these two systems is within the training. The alactic system, we're developing within the movement, the light power, and the resisted movement portion of our pre-lift. So once we're done with sort of the dynamic warm-up, and we get into the movement skills, or the acceleration type work, the plyos, and the sled work, we're going to basically make a circuit utilizing exercises for each of these categories, and we're going to make sure that the time frames within each system, or within each exercise in the circuit, fit this system. So we're going to have a movement drill. We might have that lateral shuffle drill, followed by a single leg box hop, followed by a medicine ball throw, followed by a sled bound. We're going to make sure that each of these exercises stays within 5 to 10 seconds of work. So we're producing a high level of power for a short duration. And we're going to make sure that the rest in between each station is between 15 and 30 seconds, depending on the intensity. So it works really well, this is a logistical issue. It works well in our setting where I just have one team, and we have a room that I can set up this way. But basically, we're developing that alactic energy system within the priority of improving movement, improving power, and improving that resisted movement. The aerobic system is the same idea. We're trying to kill two birds with one stone within our lift, essentially, or really the whole program itself. If our athletes are wearing a heart rate monitor, basically from dynamic warm-up until the end of the lift, they're living in a heart rate of 120 to 150 for almost that entire time. And that's because of the pace and the structure of the lift. The quad sets that keep people moving, that are built on a higher intensity exercise, an explosive lift, a mobility, a lower intensity exercise. So you're getting output and recovery, output and recovery. There's a few spikes, when we're doing Olympic lifts. Certainly you're doing a heavy triple at 90%, you're going to have a spike in the heart rate, and there's a few valleys, but for the most part, when we look at our heart rate data, we're living in that 120 to 150 range for at least 30 minutes a day. So I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time doing aerobically dedicated work, because we're actually developing the aerobic system within our training program. This is an example of our conditioning work, our ESD work, just on paper. This is, I think this was last summer's plan. So 4-day program, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are our phases, so 8 phases. Each phase is about 3 weeks. So you're looking at about 24 weeks of training from the spring until, you can see, getting into the in-season. In black are the exercises. So tempo on day 1, a circuit on day 2, tempo circuit. In red are the energy system quality we're trying to achieve. So in phase 1, cardiac capacity basically across the board. As you go, you can see power, lactic power, we start to develop in phase 3 and we kind of go. So hope that one showed up in the slides. But I just want to give you an idea, again, kind of on paper what that structure looks like. Periodization, okay? The next sort of component to our methodology that I think is really important, both on the injury reduction side and the training side, the performance training side. We utilize the conjugate model, which different sources, different people are going to have different kind of definitions. My definition is basically training multiple qualities at the same time. Okay, so in our methodology, in our programs, we're always going to have a thread of speed, power, strength, and energy system. We're always going to be addressing each of these qualities throughout kind of our entire program, versus sort of a block training approach where you're more dedicated on a single quality for a certain amount of time. Why do we utilize this method, the conjugate model? In my mind, in a team sport athlete like hockey, when can you afford not to be good at any of these things? Okay, when can I go to my coach and say, we're going to be really, really strong for like 6 weeks, but not in very good shape. Or we're going to be really explosive, but really weak. He's not gonna like that. So we need to always, he wants everything. We know we can't have everything, ideally perfect, but we need to address all of these areas. The other thing is there's no peaking period in team sports, especially not in hockey. We need to peak every weekend, right? We play hockey, we gotta come up to Vermont, we go to Maine, BU, we go to Amherst. Every weekend in our league is an absolute grind. Every team in our league is really good. So we play Friday and Saturday pretty much all year through, all season long. You need to be good every weekend. So we don't have the luxury of having sort of off weeks or games don't really matter, at least not in my setting. So we always need to be pretty good. The pros to this model, you maintain qualities. Okay, you're always touching on stuff. You're always pretty good at it. You develop a well-rounded athlete. Okay, you're pretty explosive. You're pretty in shape. You're pretty strong. The cons, we're never gonna get to top end. Okay, we're gonna sacrifice maximum strength, top end speed. We're gonna sacrifice some of these things to have more well-rounded qualities. We're never going to be power lifter strong, Olympic lifter explosive, or 100-meter sprinter fast. But I don't think that that's what hockey is. Hockey isn't a maximum of any one of these qualities. It's integration of all of them. It doesn't mean that we don't prioritize them. Okay, so there are times of the year where we're more or less focused on different qualities, especially in the off-season. As an example, in the off-season, we're focused mostly on power and strength development. We have much lower emphasis on our ESD, on our conditioning, until the end of the summer. In the preseason, we shift gears a little bit. We go more into a speed strength kind of focus, lighter loads, higher velocities, and a high ESD component. Again, we're looking to get in practice shape. In the in-season, we break it up into two halves. The first half of the year, essentially until Christmas, we go more to a strength-speed sort of idea where higher loads, lower velocities, more on the strength development side, and then we flip-flop again in the second half, speed strength. So we're looking more at that, lower loads, higher velocities. In the postseason, we look more at low load power, high velocity. We're thinking body weight, we're thinking plyometrics, med balls, very, very short, brief training sessions, trying to keep power output high, but really the emphasis becomes on recovery. Okay, in the postseason, all year long we do things for recovery, but in the postseason especially, we really need to make sure we're ready for that 3-game series the first weekend of the playoffs. Okay, we need to be fresh. If we're not fresh for Friday, Saturday, and maybe Sunday, well, the season's done. So what good does being strong, do for us? So high emphasis on recovery once we get into that postseason. Recovery and regeneration, as I said earlier, you're only as strong as you can demonstrate on game day. So if you can clean 300 Monday, but you're gassed on Friday, or you can't recover after Friday's game for Saturday, what good was the output on Monday? So we need to be doing things within our training week, within our year, to emphasize recovery and regeneration. So every single day we're doing something to try to improve the body's ability to recover from the stress of that day, whether it's training, whether it's practice, whether it's a game. We need to do something so that they're fresher the next day, fresher for the weekend, and ultimately fresher at the end of the season. In white are some of the tools we'll use. Basic stuff, roll, stretch. We'll do things like leg elevation, where you're laying on your back, feet up on the wall. Okay, really simple stuff. Diaphragmatic breathing, where we're focusing on our breath work. Hydrotherapy, hot and cold tubs. Music therapy, flush rides, compression garments, EC3D we utilize. Nutrition, okay, post-workout nutrition, and a training monitor that our guys fill out. These are just some of the tools that we use, pretty standard stuff. The key, though, is trying to match the type of stress with the recovery protocol. Okay, so in white are the recovery protocol, if you will. In red, if you can see them, are the types of stress. So structural stress, we want to utilize foam rolling. Metabolic stress, leg elevation is a good tool. Nutrition is a good tool for metabolic type stress. Okay, this is really important because if we have a training stress of high power output, an alactic type of day where we're really stressing the nervous system, a flush ride isn't going to do much to help the nervous system. It's not going to help much. Music therapy, where we're utilizing a certain type of music to help drive parasympathetic tone up and reduce sympathetic tone and calm the nervous system down, is going to be beneficial. On the other side, if coach decides he's going to have a bag session on the ice and skate the guys into the ground, and it's not necessarily neurologically taxing, but cardiovascularly they're beat down, they're muscularly sore, they're exhausted, music therapy is not going to do anything for that. It's going to be useless. Hot and cold tub might help. Leg elevation is going to help with that. So we want to try to sort of pinpoint the type of stress and the recovery protocol and be a little bit more precise with what we're doing instead of just throwing everything up against the wall. If you throw everything in the kitchen sink up against the wall, the athletes, music, or this is stupid, or I put my feet up, whatever. They're not going to buy in. You got to be a little bit more specific. Plus, when they ask you why you're doing it, kind of BS them doing it. Velocity. Another tool that we use. We have a couple pieces of technology in our facility that allow us to utilize velocity training and look at speed of movement and not just load. Something called the Elite Form Power Tracker, which is a video-based unit that measures bar speed essentially. If you're familiar with the Tendo unit, it's the same concept. It just utilizes a video system. Gives feedback on bar speed. Our Kaiser equipment, which If you think back to the video, the guy doing X pull downs, cable machines that work off air pressure, they have a display on them that gives power output. So again, with our cable work, we can look at speed of movement and power output and not simply the amount of load. It's an important tool. Velocity is a great tool for higher training age guys. Okay, it's very similar to the idea of high-level plyometrics. You may never get there with some guys. I have a few seniors that really can utilize velocity. Most of our athletes just need to get stronger. Okay? If a freshman comes in and he benches 135, you do not need to worry about how fast he benches 135. You need to make him stronger. Okay, at the far end, when a guy, when a hockey player can already bench, 270 or whatever, he's strong enough. You don't need to. A hockey player doesn't need to get more strength in that area. Once he gets there, what do? You can use velocity to keep improving his output. Okay, but it's an important tool, but later down the road. Okay, so tying it all together. My goal with this presentation was hopefully, obviously, to just give you an idea of our methodology, how we do things, but also to maybe get you guys to think. I might do things a little bit different than you do. You may agree, you may disagree, but hopefully you've seen some things that we do and maybe it's gotten you to think a little bit. Key takeaways, movement is the key to our methodology. Okay? Everything that we do needs to improve movement. If it's not doing that, then why are we doing it? Okay, we need to ask that question. There's a time and a place maybe that it is important, but for the most part it needs to improve movement. We have two goals. Number one is always to reduce injuries. Okay, we need our athletes to be healthy at the end of the year. We also want them to be strong and fast and in shape, and certainly if they're not that, then I'm in trouble as well with my job. But if they're strong and fast and in shape and chronically injured, that's no good. We can't play. So reducing injuries is number one. Improving performance is number two. Okay, and understanding that, again, revolves around movement. Our systematic approach, okay, very detailed sort of approach to how we do things and that framework that we utilize. And then the idea of human-specific training, okay, and thinking about training the human body and not necessarily sport-specific kind of ideas. Things like unilateral training and core stability kind of fall into that. With that, any questions?
Yeah, when you talk about your unilateral versus bilateral training, how do you weight your sessions? I mean, it seems like you've got quite a bit of time with the athlete. Some of us don't, and I always run into the issue of how much unilateral training do I fit in there, especially when a lot of them are youth high school athletes. Where do you have a percentage where you can say, okay, today we're going to spend 20% of my volume or 30%, whatever, on my bilateral work, and then at what point do where does the unilateral come in?
Yeah, that's a good question. When I talk about unilateral training being really important, that doesn't mean we don't bilateral train. Okay, we still do those things. We still squat, we still deadlift, we do Olympic lift. I think the key idea and in my thought process, in my growth, what I'm moving towards, I guess, is that our primary strength work, usually like your primary lower body exercise is going to be a squat, generally speaking, right? And an accessory exercise would be a lunge or a single leg squat or something like that. What I've kind of done with our guys is just flip-flop that. Our primary emphasis exercise is going to be a unilateral training or unilateral lift, single leg squat, an SLDL for hip dominant. The rear foot elevated split squat is our kind of our go-to. Our secondary, our assistance exercise is going to be a bilateral exercise. So for instance, in B series, which is our lower body, sort of generally our strength emphasis part of the lift, right now we're doing heavy SLDLs, heavy single leg deadlifts. That's our main get stronger lift. In the C series, we're doing trap bar deadlift at a much lower load than is maximum. So when you're thinking about weighting it's not a this or that. It's, in my mind, it's both. It's just where's the emphasis going to be? And for me, emphasis is more on the unilateral stuff. If I could only do one or the other, I would spend time developing the unilateral strength. Because again, in my mind, the goal is not necessarily not just load on the bar, but improving that movement on the ice or on the field. And I think there's a little more carryover.
So you actually precede your bilateral with your unilateral.
Yeah.
You answered the question. I was just going to ask if by emphasis you meant loading that unilateral movement more than bilateral.
Yeah. And I mean, and again, this, I'm not, sometimes I think people hear, single leg work, they think Bosu ball, juggling, like that's not what we're doing. I mean, we're rear foot elevated split squat is, I have a guy that's doing, we were doing sort of triphasic type stuff if you're familiar. So our first phase was eccentric work above 80%. He was doing RFE split squats at 290 for 6 sets of 3 on a 5-second eccentric. Like that's strong. You know what I mean? Like that's, and I think we could get into conversation back and forth about bilateral deficit and spinal loads and different things. And I don't think there's a right or wrong. It's just my approach. But we still get strong. We still lift heavy stuff. It's 295 one leg versus 500 two legs kind of idea.
Sort of going off of that, sort of two-pronged question based off of that. One, the time crunch. Like our athletes, we don't have that amount of time. I mean, your model is awesome. It's very comprehensive and hits sort of everything I would want to hit. But if you've got a short amount of time, have you seen this sort of model work in that environment? What about applying it? You talk about unilateral work. What about that related to the training age? So you bring freshmen, or even if you're just trying to start something like this with athletes that have been there but just are not familiar with unilateral. So teaching a single leg deadlift takes so much time and eyes on the athlete.
Yeah, no, great questions. I mean, first off, from a time standpoint, that whole framework with hockey is an hour and a half to 2 hours. So you have an hour. Most of we're Division II teams now transition to D1. It's an hour. It's 50 minutes to an hour of training. It's the same model. It's just condensed. We're never going to get to 6 sets of an Olympic lift with those athletes. You just don't have the time for that. But we're still going to try to touch on each of those categories. I guess mostly volume is just going to be what's going to be adjusted for that. That's also off season, so in season it's obviously shorter. In season we're not doing a lot of the movement training. A lot of that happens in the sport. We're not doing much time with our conditioning work. So the hour consists of roll, stretch, mobility, activation, warm up, 15 minutes, 45 minutes of lift, essentially. So it still kind of fits. It's just a matter of scaling the volume, I think, for the amount of time. When it comes to training age, again, I don't think there's a right answer. In my setting, I'll take the time with my guys to develop the abilities to do these things instead of getting them really strong and bilateral and then trying to transition them. And I think you can go the other way. It depends on what's needed. I'm looking at a 4 years with my guys. So I'm trying to slow cook them. I would rather take the time to teach and develop single leg deadlift over 6 weeks at the beginning of their freshman year and get them good at that and then get strong at that versus the other way. But it's it all comes down to demand and what's asked of you, certainly.
Just had a quick question. Going in with hockey, you're talking about kind of pelvis issues. Going along with the single leg squat, rear foot elevator, like go in season. Can you even do that? I mean, you have so many issues with hip flexors and groin. Can you still do that heavy or with all that prehab work you're doing and mobility, you're able to overcome having such tight hip flexors and the groin issues, getting those pulls?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both, I think. I think because it's common in our program, they're more well adjusted to it. But at the same time, we do transition. Rear foot elevated split squat doesn't lend itself really well in season because of hip flexors and groin. So we'll transition out of that, especially in the second half of the season, and that's when we'll utilize more single leg box squat, less stress to the hip and things like that. And again, we're still bilateral lifting, so that's still there. It's just, but yeah, there are certain exercises that are more or less conducive at certain times of the year with the pelvis.
Can you just touch a little bit on? You talked about all the issues with young kids. Just like a 2-3 minute blurb on that other speaker that you kind of took from him?
Yeah, so this guy named Kevin Neal, who's a hockey performance guy out of New Jersey, really, really bright guy, and he's done a lot of research and studying a lot on the pelvic issues of hockey players. The biggest issue, and it's out of our hands really, but it's early specialization. That's the biggest problem. And you look at any sport, they're each going to have significant problems. I don't have the reference of the numbers, but in that same study with the youth hockey players, he actually looked at some youth football players too, and they had very similar problems. So it's not just a hockey issue, but it's an early specialization issue. It's a social issue, absolutely. I think that, ideally, getting kids to play multiple sports, proper training. We all know that there's a whole lot of really, really bad training out there that's probably worse than doing no training at all. These are all pie in the sky kind of things, but just as far as the pelvic issues, yeah, it's primarily that. And then, you're gonna, especially at the collegiate level, the professional level of any sport, you're gonna have the problems because that's all the athlete does, and they have to do to play at that level. The problem is we're seeing it earlier and earlier and earlier, and that's the concern. Anything else? Oh, yeah.
To kind of piggyback on that, what do you do specifically to deal with FAI and the labor affairs, and then kind of how do you see those injuries manifest themselves?
So what do we do specifically? I mean, I think from a sort of prevention standpoint, it's a lot of the same. It's learning how to move correctly. It's addressing hip flexor tightness and glute activation. It's getting proper movement is the big thing. I think also, and this is again a reason why I'm a big believer in unilateral training. When you're in a bilateral stance, you're squatting, your pelvis is essentially locked in. It can rotate forward and backward, but it's basically locked in. So if you have a bony issue in your hip already, and you drive into a heavy squat where you're going to end up in end range motion of that joint, you're going to exacerbate that problem. So you can limit range of motion. You can find out what the proper range of motion is of that athlete. But if they're significantly limited, are you only ever going to do quarter squats? Is that the best tool for the job? One of the nice things I think that we found with the unilateral stuff, especially like single leg squat, the rear foot elevated split squat, your pelvis has a little bit of play now in the frontal and transverse plane. So an athlete who has a significant dysfunction and they're going to go into significant anterior tilt really early in bilateral stance, they can kind of their pelvis will find a good spot to be able to move through range of motion because there's just more degrees of freedom in that area. So the unilateral training helps, I guess, kind of work around some of those issues. And again, if they have the problem, the only thing that's going to fix it is surgery. So how do we work around that and not make it worse and still try to develop the qualities we need to be successful?
I had a question about the lateral training for your younger skaters. And this I was thinking of with the plyometrics also. You've got strong athletes, but their knees are not trained for land impact, especially if they really specialize on ice. Ice is so much more friendly laterally to knees than ground is, and I'm just wondering the progression.
Yeah.
That age athletes and women athletes, what I want to do more protective for forces on the knee when you switch to lateral driving.
Great question. Progression is the key. So all of our everything we do has a progression, but our movement work and our plyometric work especially is all progressed from complexity where there's more force or less force to more force. So basically think of it, we're trying to develop stability first before real power output. We talk about, the actual definition of plyos. We don't get to plyos until very late in our program. We start, as far as the plyometric progression or jumping progression, everything starts box jump, where we're jumping up to a box. So we're producing power up, but limiting gravity coming down. So we're up to a box and stabilizing. And we always want to start and finish in the same position because we're always focused on developing sort of the brakes first before we put the horsepower in the car. So we jump up to a box to be able to land and work on the technique of landing and eccentric strength. We progress then over a hurdle where we jump over a hurdle and we stick landing to more of a bounce in between, and then finally kind of true continuous plyos. Our movement stuff's the same way. So that lateral shuffle drill starts out very simply, shuffle, stick and hold. Can you control your knee? We're coaching that. We just want stability. Shuffle, stick and hold. Later in the summer, later in the off season, it's rapid back and forth. How fast can you cut, produce power, change direction? But we don't get there until we've hit each step before that. And again, if you think about cars, we're developing brakes before we try to put horsepower in. If you've got you put a Ferrari engine in a Honda Civic, it's going to go really fast until you try to turn, and then it's going to go straight off the road because the brakes can't handle it. That's the same thing with our athletes. We want to make sure that they can stop and control their body weight. That's a big component to the plyometric progressions. Before then, we're worried about really improving power.
All right, so we're going to kind of transition over to Elaine here with EC3D. He's going to do a little presentation. It's probably good to have everybody just kind of stand up and walk over. And we'll take about